Channel 11 presents Talk It Over. Here's your host, Ellen Adelstein.
Tonight we have a very special show for you. It's a show on the Middle East and the Israel and Egyptian peace situation. After that, I will have an interview with the leader of Jordan, so it should be an extremely exciting and revealing show. Last March and April, I spent 7 weeks in Israel and Egypt on a journalistic learning experience. My trip began in Israel as one of 40 Americans from all the media, TV, radio, and the press, to spend 10 days touring Israel under the sponsorship of the American Zionist Federation. While I was in Israel, the terrible Saturday bus massacre happened. In fact, one of the newsmen with our group went to visit friends at a kibbutz and got caught on the road behind the bus. Through much maneuvering, he arrived back in Jerusalem and briefed all of us with the horrible details, which gave us the first really accurate information, which we phoned back home. Subsequently, I stayed and went into Lebanon the day after the official UN ceasefire, with an Israeli military escort leading us through the rubble of the Lebanese villages. If you're asking yourself, wasn't it dangerous? The answer is yes. There were landmines all along the shoulder of the road. I, in my naivete, thought a ceasefire meant just that. It doesn't. In Lebanon, a ceasefire means everyone stops fighting long enough to go to the bank and cash their check, and then returns and picks up their rifle. From Israel, I flew to Cairo, Egypt. From Israel, I flew to Greece and then on to Cairo, Egypt, since of course you cannot fly from Israel to Egypt, nor even phone or wire. Now you may be asking yourself, what's a nice Jewish girl like me doing in Cairo, Egypt? The answer is, I have a friend whom I met in Tucson the previous year. He is one of the leading journalists in Egypt, having written many books, and is a regular columnist for a news magazine, similar to Newsweek. He had accompanied President Sadat on his visit to America in the spring of 1977 and had stayed after the Egyptian leader to tour the United States for a month. We became acquainted and we had many political discussions about why can't there be peace in the Middle East? Why both Israel and Egypt desperately need peace on their borders so that they may turn their attention inwardly. Both nations needed to get down to enriching the daily lives of their peoples instead of shedding blood in the desert and depleting their resources. My friend invited my husband and I to come visit him and see his country, and that is what I did. There was only one little thing he forgot to mention to me, and that is he is one of the most influential communist Marxist leaders and writers in Egypt today. When I arrived in Israel, there was a feeling of hope in the air. After all, the Mideast peace talks had not broken down completely yet, and the idea of peace is too euphoric to let slip away without a struggle. But after the bus tragedy, and then Lebanon, I could feel the mood of the country change as soldiers were called up and troop transports rolled from the Dead Sea towards the Lebanese border. The same was true when I traveled to Egypt, with people still clinging to hope when I arrived, but with despair setting in when I left at the end of April. I had even started hearing Egyptian utterances of, perhaps we will have to go to war again to regain our lands in the Sinai. Throughout my journey to both lands, I became increasingly despondent about the chances for peace. Because, you see, I, as the outsider, could travel through both countries and see the great similarities. I could see that what they had in common was so much greater than what separated them. Why, I kept asking myself, must they go on killing each other? What reason on God's earth could be so important that these two very similar people felt compelled to fight on? There wasn't a reason. The answer was simple. If only they knew how close they were. Many, many times in Egypt, where the people are some of the friendliest and most warm anywhere, I was asked, "What are you?" "An American," I replied. And the answer was, "Yes, but you look Egyptian." To which I would reply, "That's because I am a Semitic cousin of yours. I am Jewish." I waited and watched for the slightest change of expression to reflect a change in attitude towards me, because now they knew I was Jewish. There was none. I did not feel any intrinsic, gut-level Jewish hatred. It simply does not exist. One must remember that it is not quite so difficult for the Egyptians to change their minds toward a former enemy. After all, they are accustomed to mind shifts, from the former monarchy of King Farouk to the dictator Nasser and his love of the Russians, and now to the friendship of President Sadat and the Americans. Israel is only a very young enemy compared with the ongoing clashes Egypt has had with some of her other Arab neighbors. The other extremely important message I learned from my Jewish doctor friend, who is the elderly leader of the Cairo Jewish community. I have done an entire program with him, which will be on next week. It is on the status of the Egyptian Jewish community, which was once a vital 80,000 strong and now numbers 170 individuals. In talking about the role of the Egyptian Jew before the dictator Nasser, Dr. Riso Levy states, "We never had any trouble, never. The Jews were a welcome and influential segment of the country, but like so many other intellects and wealthy people who could threaten Nasser, they were driven out by imprisonment, by sequestration of their property, and denial of business opportunity. I found that the average Egyptian I met had old and dear farmer neighbors and friends who were Jewish. When they spoke of them to me, it was with love and fondness. There is no inherent anti-Semitism or anti-Jewishness in Egypt, as is found in so many other lands. One reason this is so is a deep respect for the Jewish religion per se. The Muslims are a deeply and intensely religious people, and they respect another's equally strong faith. I heard several Muslims say that they admired the Israelis and the way they kept their dietary laws. In both lands, there is real respect for the Sabbath, be it Friday in Egypt or Saturday in Israel. Other customs are the same, with the Muslims also circumcising their male children. There is a great respect and protection of religion and religious houses and sites in both countries. The synagogues in Egypt, even during the wars with Israel, were never defaced. The lifestyles are similar in both lands. The afternoon siesta, in the middle of the business day, which drives us Americans mad, holds sway in both Israel and Egypt. And the bureaucrats and their procrastinations and inefficiencies are very similar, much, much worse than in our country. Need I mention inflation and the domestic economies of both peoples, how they need their capital for butter and telephones instead of weapons. But the greatest hope they have in common is the children, and both peoples' great emphasis and love for their little ones. America, in contrast, is not a baby land. You have to go out of your way to find a baby shop. And one does not often see people pushing baby carriages down the main streets of our cities. Yet in Cairo and Tel Aviv, this is a common sight. And there are many, many children's specialty stores in the shopping districts. Even though ready-made items are very difficult to come by in these inflationary-racked lands. In Cairo one day, my friend's wife took their 4-year-old to work with her. When I looked astonished, he explained that workers often do this. Everyone loves the children, and they stroll from office to office, with co-workers stopping to visit with them and give them candy. The faces of the children haunted me in both lands. I kept looking at the little Semitic faces, and I kept wondering why. Why must they grow up to fight? Negotiations are now taking place, thanks to President Carter in Camp David. The children and their parents will learn that they can live and learn and work together in peace. I predict a great economic future for both lands, working together side by side. The Israelis have the brain and technological power needed to build economic wealth. The Egyptians have a large, skilled labor force that requires employment. And when both are put together in joint enterprises, watch out, America! I do not want you to get the impression that there is not a great intellectual capacity among Egyptians. For the Egyptians had a great and wondrous society many thousands of years ago. And Cairo is the learning center of the Arab world, with several outstanding universities there. But there has been a brain drain in Egypt, which started with the exodus of the intellectuals during Nasser's time, and continues today with the Saudis and their petrodollars raiding and hiring all of the top engineers, doctors, technicians, and educated people. I see an economic merger of Israeli expertise and the sweat of the common Egyptian laborer to build a wondrous oasis in the Middle East. Imagine what a tourist mecca it will be to journey freely from Israel to Egypt, seeing all the biblical lands together, relaxing and spearfishing by the Red Sea, and journeying on to Luxor and the Valley of the Kings, which is very similar in climate to Tucson, except that it has the beautiful Nile meandering along its banks, separating the hotel embankment from the tombs where Tut and his relatives resided, an oasis. I'll be back with another Middle Eastern view of the situation with an interview with a Jordanian leader in just a moment. I'm talking with Dr. Jamal Shahair, who is a member of the National Council in Jordan. How is this council elected, Doctor?
This council actually was not elected due to the difficulties which arose from the parliament, which was elected in 1966 to continue functioning. Mm-hmm. The parliament met and authorized the king the legislative power. Then the king chose same number of people, which is 60, mm-hmm. From various parts of the country, from various political factions, representative people to the business, to industry, to the labor unions, to the professions, some political factions, some people who were always members in the parliament, and he delegated the authority of legislation to this new body until the time comes where elections could take place and the parliament could function.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned 60 members. Are 30 from the East Bank and 30 from the West Bank?
The parliament was like this, supposed to be by constitution. 30 from the West Bank, and 30 from the East Bank. But the legislative body, the new one, the new Consultative Council, 15 from West Bank origin or from Palestinian origin who reside in the Eastern Bank. And the rest, 45, are from Transjordanian origin.
Well, now, speaking of the status of the people who are living in the West Bank of Jordan, which is now under Israeli rule, legally they are considered...
Jordanians, yes.
Okay.
They carry Jordanian passports.
All right. And then politically...
Politically, they are supposed to be PLO responsibility. That was a resolution passed in 1974 by an Arab Summit conference, which gave legality to the PLO to represent the Palestinians, regardless of what kind of passports they carry, regardless of where they live, whether within Palestinian land or in any Arab country or in any part of the world. So the PLO is responsible for Palestinians wherever they are. So this is a political responsibility. This created in Jordan a lot of discussion about how the political life and the political institution should be made. So we reached more or less a compromise between the legal responsibility of Jordan to the Palestinians and the political responsibility of the PLO to the Palestinians.
And where did the Israelis come in?
The Israelis have until now, they are considered by the world as occupying force, but they are practicing as if they have sovereignty on that land. And they have they started first with the military government in various areas, and then they allowed free elections for the municipalities. And now, after the Camp David Accords, they are supposed to hold elections for some kind of local government under Israeli sovereignty, at least for the next 5 years.
And now, does Jordan give these people under Israeli dominion at the moment financial aid?
Well, all the administration, all the civil servants are paid by the Jordan government. The municipalities also are aided, and they receive loans from the Jordan government, and they report all their activities to the Jordan government. For instance, health department, etc. Except Jerusalem area, which was annexed by the Israelis, and they don't allow any contact between the services in that larger Jerusalem area and the Jordan government. But it's done sometimes on the quiet, you know,
quietly.
Quiet, yeah,
Yes.
that's it.
How can there be peace in the Middle East, specifically with the Palestinian problem? Now there are 2 million Palestinian, homeless Palestinians who originally lived in what is now Israel. What can we do as a world to make peace in that area?
Well, actually, the first major step has been taken by the Palestinians in general and the Arabs in general also, who are also concerned. And that is that Israel has to be accepted as a sovereign state on Palestinian or Arab land. This is the major step. It took us 30 years to accept it. But after all, the Israeli question is a question of thousands of years. And with the Arab psychological setup being under the British and the French, and before that, and of course under the Italians in Libya, and before that under the Turks for over 500 years, you could imagine the fear, the frustration, the lack of political consciousness. All these things add up. So it took now 30 years for this thing to be accepted. Then this acceptance, of course there are fanatics on both sides who still reject the idea of Israel having existence as a sovereign state in Arab land. There are also fanatics in Israel who want to keep the occupied territories, and they want even to have more territories, etc. But generally speaking, one say that Israel now is being accepted by the Arabs as a state in the Middle East. The next step also has been taken maybe it wasn't taken in the best way possible, and that is what we call the Sadat Initiative. Visiting Jerusalem was a great event, no doubt about it. Also now the Camp David Accords and what's going on now, all these are major steps on the road to peace. To my mind, war now is more or less a very, very distant possibility. What we are facing now really is to make this process of peace as quick as possible and without causing disruption in the Arab world. This can take place by recognizing more the Palestinian question, the question of these Palestinian peoples you have
These
just
2 million people.
mentioned.
Yes.
Not the refugees, but as a people.
Yes.
As a people. The refugees is part of the Palestine problem. But also another part of it is that they are people. They have to have some kind of identity. And the more the steps are taken, or the faster the process is going, the better. Another point which is very, very important, that all these efforts should not be a cause for disuniting the Arabs. If this process can take place, which is initiated by Egypt, by drawing more the moderates like the Saudi Arabia and the Jordanians, and maybe later other countries, to a more agreed policy, I think this will be a permanent peace, and we look at it as a just peace, and it will start solving the real problems of the area.
If you were an Israeli, let me ask you to put yourself in their position, how would you go about making a just solution to the Palestinian problem?
If I was an Israeli with the history similar to the history of the struggle of the present leadership, who have seen the horrors for their fathers and heard about their great-grandfathers, and they have seen it maybe themselves, I would do the same.
The Holocaust.
I would do the same. But for a responsible leader, he has to curb down his fears as much as possible. So I would expect that the sons of Begin and his colleagues will be more moderate, will be less afraid than they are now. If I was a Jewish Israeli now, probably I would behave the same way.
But I'm asking you to go one step farther. If you were say the leader of Israel, what would you do to assure your safety and yet try and do something humane and sensible towards solving the problem of these displaced Palestinians?
I will try not to press for a unilateral agreement with Egypt. I will try to understand more what are the problems with the Western Bank, and I will try to wait until the moderate Arabs join this peace effort. I will not hurry so much if I was responsible.
I urge you to join me next week on Talk It Over here on Channel 11 at 9:30 on Saturday night. I have a very special show that I filmed in Cairo, Egypt, with Dr. Guido Risalevi, the titular head of the Jewish community. In this show, we talk about how a once thriving Jewish population of 80,000 is now reduced to 170 individuals. So please join me.
You've been watching Talk It Over with your host, Ellen Adelstein. Join us every week at this same time for Talk It Over here on Channel 11. The preceding program was pre-recorded.